This is a topic I feel like I've covered, but I kind of haven't, and it's kind of just craving overall connection with the fear of vulnerability. And I think this is really where maybe even majority people are at, but I know it's a spot that I've been at in my life, and a spot that I could definitely see other people experiencing, because you're wanting such depth, such connection, but it's very hard to get there when you're kind of scared of everything that goes into it. And it makes sense to feel that way. It's definitely not ridiculous to have this fear or this uncertainty in the future and in people, but I feel like it's kind of a double-edged sword, especially when you're wanting to feel more connection, more depth from people, but you're scared to go there, even for yourself, even. And I think this is somewhere where a lot of people are kind of stuck at, and that's really the fear part. That fear is holding them back from actually forming something, so much deeper. And that's the issue. Craving connection, but fearing vulnerability is a lot of things that I think people are kind of struggling with now. And I feel like if we want to feel better about it, we definitely have to try a lot harder to form these connections. And with that fear, I feel like it's definitely what I have to premise and talk about in the video, because it's definitely so much easier said than done. And when I say, that you should do these certain things, we have to really take into account that it'll feel different and work differently for everyone, but it is overall getting over that fear. And I think it's so much better to have the choice to decide if you want a connection or if you want to be open, than just not having a choice at all. Not having a say in how you want to feel and how you want to express yourself because of that fear. And I think that fear is something that a lot of people have right now. And that's what makes it so hard to form these deeper connections. You're fearing being vulnerable, but you want connections. This creates a bunch of problems. If you're craving connections, you can't fear vulnerability. And I think a lot of times when you're trying to form these deeper connections and you want to have such depth with these people, you can never get there if you're only on the surface. And I think going past that surface can be so damaging and so scary, when really that fear is what's holding you back. That doubt is going to kill more things than failure ever could. And I think if we want to feel a lot more confident in this, we have to be open with it. We have to accept that there is a risk involved, but if we want to feel something with such depth, and such magnitude, it's going to take a lot out of us. You definitely are going to get out what you put in. And I think if you're not putting in enough, if you're not putting in any openness and trying to be open with people and form these connections, how do you expect to find something with such depth? And I think relationships really need to be focused on this, and very open with being vulnerable, because a lot of times I've even spoken about, communication. And I think a lot of people say that communication is key, but it means nothing without that vulnerability. How are you going to actually learn and grow and talk to people when you're fearing that? And I think, kind of on that note about communication, is this idea that everyone says communication is key. And I think really it's comprehension. And before that is vulnerability. It doesn't matter how much you communicate if you're still holding back what you say, and how you really feel. And I think that's what makes it so much harder to actually have these relationships and these connections. Communication is key only if you can be open, only if you can be vulnerable. And I think that is something that a lot of people are forgetting, and that's definitely something that comes down to fear, and also this idea that maybe people aren't ready, or people don't want to be ready to kind of have these type of conversations, but they have to happen if you want to feel, so much more. And a lot of this video is going to be focusing on that feeling that you need to have if you want to feel more open and feel better in these relationships. Communication is only key if you're being vulnerable. And you have to be open enough to actually communicate these things. It doesn't matter how much you're talking if you're only saying half of what you feel. And I think a lot of times when people are realizing that it doesn't matter how much we're talking and actually trying to communicate with these people, if comprehension and vulnerability isn't a part of it, then it doesn't matter what we say to each other. It doesn't matter how well the conversation or communication goes if you guys aren't actually expressing what you feel, without this fear that it's going to be, backhanded, or it's not going to actually be valued by the other person. How do you expect to form anything, how to resolve anything when you're holding each other back? And I think a lot of times these smaller issues can build up, and it really stresses out a relationship. It can stress it out and kind of build up and kind of fracture it in that sense. And I think a lot of times it is mentally what's holding people back. This fear is something that a lot of people need to have. If you're trying to form communication and form these connections, openness is required. It's not something simply asked of you. It's not something that you can kind of dodge. And I think we have to be a lot more aware of that, that we're trying so much harder to form these connections for a reason, and it goes with our openness and our vulnerability. And I think being vulnerable is really scary because it is the closest you can get, on a non-physical plane of talking to someone and building that connection. I think a lot of people are so scared that other people will maybe see them the way they see themselves. And I think this fear is very real and it's very prominent. And I think it happens a lot, but really it's so much harder to actually form anything when we are holding ourselves back so much. And this holding ourselves back just makes it so much harder to have people even, get the chance to value you. And I think when we are kind of withholding ourselves, we have to realize that that withholding is definitely something that takes away the opportunities to find people that are actually for us, people that are actually going to find us. How do you expect to find people that are for you, that will value you and love you correctly if you keep hiding yourself? And I think a lot of times people are doing this, very on a subconscious level, very low key, and they kind of don't even have this clue that they're actually doing it. But when you are limiting yourself and not saying how you feel and not expressing your own thoughts, whether it is in connections or communication or even in friend groups and friendships, you have to realize that this is something that's going to damage you. You're not being yourself. And I feel like a lot of people have this misconstrued idea of being yourself just means, dressing or talking how you want. No, being yourself means being authoritative in your authenticity. And I think authenticity is something that we lack so much now, and it's very hard to form any communication and any connections when we're lacking this authenticity. How are you going to get to know people if you can't even get to know yourself that well? And when I'm speaking on, forming this vulnerability but craving that connection, it's this wanting to feel valued, wanting to feel loved. We just have to make sure that we're loving ourselves first. We're loving ourselves correctly, if that. And I think a lot of people, I've even made videos on what it looks like to focus on yourself and what loving yourself looks like. And a lot of people don't tend to grasp the actual key that's involved. It is the focusing on your journey. It's not a destination. It's not this idea or this way you can just say, okay, I'm happy. No, it's a choice to choose yourself time and time again. And I think that is when you start to build self-respect and self-preservation, and you start to feel that level of love. I feel like even craving connection is healthy, but when we're doing it with this fear that people are only going to damage us, or that we're not going to find anything that's worth breaking out of this, isolation or solitude that we put ourselves in, it's going to get so much harder to actually feel ready for it, and to feel confident not only in ourselves but in other people that they won't damage us. And I think that risk that we take is definitely the bravest thing we can do. That risk to go after love is so much more prominent than we believe. When you're taking the risk to find love, that means everything. That is the connection. And I think when you are being so much more open to it and you're being susceptible to finding that level of love, that is entirely what gives it value. It's not something that you specifically had to do in the past or something that you need to change for the future, but it's being open enough to know that you can have this connection. You can have something happen that means a lot to you, that means, you will find love, you will find this relationship. And I think when we are craving this vulnerability and being open, we have to do it both ways. As much as we want to build a connection, we have to be that ready to be open. And being open is communicating how you feel. It is saying, what is on your mind when people ask you, when people ask, how are you, and stuff like that. And you think about it, we're kind of conditioned to not really say how we feel because of this fear of judgment, or this fear that people aren't going to like it, or the social credit we gain, or whatever it may be. When we're doing that, we're missing out on ourselves. It's going to get harder to even read yourself and to understand how you feel if you keep lying to yourself about that. And I think when people kind of build this up, you kind of condition yourself so negatively that now it's like you don't even know what you want anymore. Are you doing these things for other people, or are you doing them for yourself? And this is something that we have to ask ourselves. This is a real question that will come up time and time again, especially when we are looking to form deeper and better connections, especially healthier ones.